to Radically Rethinking Railways in Australia, where we challenge our viewers to think about Australian railways in a new way. Hosted by the Mad Professor. This channel is dedicated to those who've seen through all the false narratives, and if you think that might be you, then congratulations. So many others will be burdened down by their misapprehension about what is truly wrong with our railways. Some of them have laboured under the view that Australia is somehow underpopulated for a country that wishes to have good railways. But we saw in several of our past episodes how wrong that view is. Others have thought that it was due to a lack of money or a conspiratorial road lobby, but in truth it was none of these things. It was all to do with the incompetence of our political and bureaucratic classes, and we will learn more about that in this episode. In fact, we did a whole episode, number 4, about muddling through, to look at the issue as a matter of political culture. Of course, those politicians and bureaucrats wanted you to believe their muddling was unavoidable. Heaven help us if they actually took responsibility for their actions. But how did these narratives reach wider society? And what is the true history that never got reported? We will look at the historiography from 3 points of view: published historians, social history, and nostalgia. Official histories are probably the least interesting form of railway history, and also probably the least influential on the way the public thinks about railways, so we will cover them only briefly. As we've discovered in passing through so many of these episodes, Australia built a massive railway system despite its low and dispersed population, lack of money, and relatively unsophisticated economy. The very first decades of the story are mostly a tale of political and bureaucratic game playing, but for which the public was the loser. The first railways were privately proposed and even privately owned, but their early failure caused the colonial governments to rescue them by direct ownership. This was long before any socialist ideology sprang forth, and before any such attempts in the mother country or in the United States of America which we might have mimicked. And this was no coincidence, given that many of the various legislative councils and assemblies were controlled by men who had invested in these projects, so of course they wanted them rescued. Maybe today you would see a different type of insolvency remedy tried, like the US Chapter 11, or a temporary administrator or receiver, or even a loan. The Sydney Railway Company, for example, was short of cash flow, but not fundamentally insolvent. But due to the corrupt local politics of these squattocrat parliaments, we ended up with government railway systems. And if you read a tome like VR to 62, the most notable of the official histories, it is all there. In these early decades you can see the genesis of later problems: different rail gauges, poor technical standards such as structure gauge, acceptable curvature and gradient, or light construction. But in those early decades, they were not yet realised to be problems. Rail had a productivity advantage head and shoulders above the alternatives, and the economy of construction was valued. Even gauge didn't matter much. Not only were the different colonial systems not yet connected, but in South Australia, Western Australia, Tasmania and Queensland, there was not really a rail network, just freestanding mini-networks out of each port. But the real story of our rail history was corruption. Where the first railways were supposed to make money for investors, in government hands, their mission subtly changed. As a political enterprise, railways remind us of the parable of the 6 blind men and the elephant, each one holding a different part of the elephant and saying it is a different thing. The one holding the elephant's leg thinks it is a tree trunk, but the one holding the elephant's trunk thinks it is a hose. Our railway suffered from that too. The local politician thinking it was a political inducement, while the bureaucrat thought it was a chance to expand his empire. The farmer in distant lands thought it was a way of subsidising his produce being transported. Yet other politicians talked about opening up country and other such nonsense. The unions and organised workforce thought of it as a source of thousands of industrial jobs. Little thought was given to the taxpayer or voter who was ultimately carrying the can for such a system. So a colony like Victoria had an explicit policy, the Octopus Act, for expanding the rail system in all directions, with little thought given to whether it was all justified. With substantial gold revenue and fantasies of intensive settlement by British migrants, this was all the justification they needed. In New South Wales we saw a cult of charismatic rail commissioners, men like Whitten or Eddy, who exploited a colonial parliamentary system that existed before the strong political parties came along. The system was more like the USA of today, where individual members of parliament might be swayed to support this premier or that one by promises of new lines, and the commissioners in turn played this system, able to expand their empires accordingly. But one evil that soon crept in was that if the commissioner was only required to balance the books for the system as a whole, then the profitable bits near the major cities and ports could carry a lot of loss-making extensions. And the corruption spawned a rule book in each system, with thousands of line items, specific carriage rates for different products, different lines, you name it. A rate for carrying hay, or for carrying circus elephants, and one that differed not by the cost of carrying it, nor even by simple metrics like mileage, but whatever rate was required to promote political patronage. And the passenger system was no better. The old timetables do not reveal the colonial system as being above that sort of political patronage. But this was all about fares. We certainly did not see what we saw in the UK, with improvements made to the passenger system. Faster lines, bigger trains, better comfort, all reaching the public. A government megalith would never need to do that. And these trends were the start of a more serious decline of rail transport that came along when road and air transport became a thing. That is, while politicians could interfere with some railway metrics, like fare or route, rail was becoming what economists call the inferior good, something that you only purchase when a better option is more expensive. But nobody likes to talk corruption or imagine their colonial ancestors indulged in it. So we get alternative narratives about this period, like imagining rail technology was vulnerable to road or air competition, or that Australia was underpopulated, because those ideas place the blame outside the politics and bureaucracy that ran it. And let's be clear, a politician or rail bureaucrat could have chosen to behave better than they did. They could have resisted the allure of empire building or bribing their voters. They could have put the benefits of better technology back to the passenger or shipper, but why would they? And books like VR to 62 outline the corruption and politics but do not condemn it. And again, why would they? This book was literally paid for by the rail commissioners. They would not write the history that would condemn their forebears, lest they too be condemned by the writers of today. So this channel is here to tell you what they did. There is much to condemn about colonial history, whether it is the genocide and dispossession of the original peoples of the continent, the destruction of its environment, or just, as we've looked at today, how the early politics of the colonies were at least as corrupt as it is today. We can imagine those days as a wonderful costume drama of people in big hats, smoking pipes, and riding in old wooden carriages, but that is just cosplay. Their machinations and motives were little different from today. It is not hard for people to find evidence, even in the 1850s, of politicians and bureaucrats up to no good, whether it is in the parliamentary Hansard, in the newspapers, the annual reports, or even just by researching the timetables and rule books. If you were able to truly imagine yourself in this drama, what would you really see? Vast sums of public wealth being taken for private gain, vanity projects with public money, cowardly and lazy bureaucrats who didn't want to work hard to make the system efficient, because who would gain? They were not shareholders in such a system. The only shareholders were the public, undereducated and poorly informed ordinary citizens. And we do not sing the praises of private enterprise. Both public and private ownership have their roles. But what we saw in Australia was the failure of public ownership. We read and hear very little of those private railways in Western Tasmania, or Silverton, or the vast timber, coal and sugar networks. And that's because there is little incentive for those companies to play those silly games. We can wind up by saying these official histories aren't so much a problem that they are wrong, but they are self-serving. We see the powers that be tell the story in a way that absolves themselves of the continuing impact of political corruption and incompetence. A more damaging impact on the railway narrative has been done by the likes of Patsy Adams-Smith and those who want to tell the railway story as social history. This type of storytelling can be very compelling, highly personalised around her own life experience, growing up the daughter of a railway employee at a distant outpost. Broader political movements in the 20th century moved from a very right-wing method, the history of great men, usually old, straight and white men, into a very leftist view of the history of ordinary people and their ordinary lives. The railways were, by the 1920s, monstrously large organisations, usually the largest organisation in each state, and only rivalled at the federal level by the post office or the military. These railways were hybrid social creations, with a white-collar section situated in a large city office, blue-collar depots, workshops, permanent way maintenance functions, the signallers, the very large cohort of train crew, and a large customer service function based at stations or goods sheds. And this was so unlike any other organisation, public or private, at the time. And the railways penetrated the city, the suburbs, the country areas, and even the most remote and inhospitable places, often needing to bring in the people and equipment they needed from far away. Even the feeling of connectedness to the outside world, something Patsy Adams-Smith dwells on, hinged on the railway as a last resort transport service, the mail they carried, and also the copper wires that the railways themselves built, or at least hosted for the post office, but on their land. Patsy Adams-Smith entitled her main book, Romance of the Australian Railways, and through different chapters describes this railway, extensive in people and distance, as some sort of benign club for its employees, and how being in the railway gave a sense of identity to people who were often forced by their employment to live in small rural communities a long way from their original homes. Like the official histories, there is nothing actually untrue about anything she writes. She brings up the old timetables, the notes of opening days for railways in colonial times, newspaper editorials, the quirky letters that railway employees used to write, even the maintenance records of locomotives. Anything that demonstrates the prosaic, workaday life of railway employees and passengers. Her method democratises the railway story away from the great men, those old white straight and by now dead men, and for that she definitely earns a credit. But her overall narrative, like all the narratives we consider on this channel, leads the unwary astray. It tells the layperson that all this technical stuff was marvellous, when in fact it was outdated and inefficient even when built. It tells the rail enthusiast things they fetish. Old trains and tracks were really good when in fact they were very poor. One loves to imagine fondly her situation of being in a remote railway location with the toot of the train whistle, the bustle of employees and passengers, and the quaint customs they employed. But they were wasting money and impoverishing the rest of the country through their actions. She's ambivalent about those things in the official histories, the incompetence of badly planned and laid out networks, or the corruption that saw many unnecessary lines built. She is also unnecessarily Pollyanna-ish about the future as she imagined it from the 1970s, that recent improvements like transcontinental standardisation or the completion of dieselisation was the turning over of a new leaf. Of course it wasn't, and we'll get to that. Unlike the official histories, these social histories and commentaries have probably had a more dire effect on the lies that rail enthusiasts believe and transport advocates. The corruption of the great men, the big men who wrote the official history, co-opted the working class by necessity. They were accomplices to the crime. And both historical narratives converge at a place we've been to in our earlier episodes. According to the joint narrative of both historical methods, the railways eventually failed when the big bad road lobby monster came along. We destroyed that narrative in our episode, Who Blamed Roger Rabbit. But bigger than that, they both play into the narratives that continue to suppress rail transport. The one that points the finger, Australia's supposed lack of population and density. We overcame that one in our episode, Australians, Are You Dense? Or our episode that challenges the lack of mainline electrification in this country, Electric Dreams. You can find links to our earlier episodes below this video. Both the official and social historical narratives absolve the powers that be of their responsibility for what they did, in the distant past, but also in the recent past and present, and even what they intend to do in the future. These old white straight males may well be dead, but their successors are not a lot different from them in the way they think and work, even if, in our time, they won't be laying vast networks of crappy railway into the distant wastelands. But the final narrative we have to find, the third cord in our braided rope, is nostalgia itself. We are all guilty of it. Tourist and preserved railways trade on it, and it is well they do. Imagine a world where we hadn't any reminders of the way we used to live. What better way to teach children what it was like than to show them? There is nothing more educating about life in the 19th century with steam trains than to ride them, see their motion and smell their smoke. Nostalgia used to be defined as a medical illness. Thankfully we don't medicalise it anymore. But let's be real about what nostalgia does. Like the social histories, it normalises for the sufferer the idea that the world they remember from their youth was a better world than today. Now whatever you make of change in the world, or in your world since your youth, it is not the place of this channel to evaluate your life, but saying the railways were better was both silly and wrong. In our first episode, The Luckiest Line, we looked at the railway to Hurstbridge in Wurundjeri country, a line that in all probability wouldn't have survived all the changes that have happened to Australian railways, but thankfully it has. With its electrification, modernisation, and now duplication, it is a much better railway in every respect than it has ever been in its life. Probably not as much fun though. Your mad professor remembers the single-car wooden carriage, called a double-ended Tate, after the old straight, white and dead male who ran the Victorian railways in the 1900s. It shuttled up the line on a Sunday night. Very few people on it. For a rail enthusiast, it was gold. It was everything that could symbolise, in the 1970s, some of the romance of the 1920s railway, but also everything wrong with the railway. If you weren't there, you may not know the joys of the metal hangers that passengers could grab, clanging away as the train jolted and swayed, the wooden sliding doors, the seats, the dim lighting by incandescent bulbs, the grinding of the motors. Nothing like a train today. Recall our third episode, The Accidental Death of a Railway, about the deliberate and wanton destruction of the Healesville line. This line too, your mad professor recalls in its dying days. The rail motor shuttling backwards and forwards. My poor grandmother was pestered several times for more rides on it. It was dying by then. Those glory days when a full-size train could do 80 kilometres an hour on it were before my time. We normalised the railways of our youth in our minds as what railways ought to be like, even when that defies the arrow of history and progress. Your mad professor recalls the very end of steam. The South Maitland and Richmond Vale Railways in the Gurringi and the Wabbagal lands around Newcastle and Maitland. Older viewers may remember even more widespread steam. Younger viewers will also set their nostalgia baseline to possibly later periods. The last of the non-air conditioned passenger trains maybe in the 1990s. Maybe the plethora of old diesel locos no longer with us. Maybe your memory is of a line that closed, but well after those lines that your mad professor recalls, having ridden the last trains to Beechworth, Yea, Yarram, Toogoolawah, Toronto, Mount Gambier, or wherever you might have been. There is no right period to be nostalgic about. And that's not to say there weren't good things in the past. As should be clear to channel viewers, many decisions in the past were very regrettable. For example, closing specific lines. But generally, what is left of the railways is marginally faster, definitely more comfortable, and more efficient in leaps and bounds over what was there before. In a future episode, we will look at what is wrong with Australian rail enthusiasts, but for the moment, we will leave it with our observation. If you are a sucker, you will believe those official narratives. Yes, the crazy corruption of the 1800s was unfortunate, but let's look the other way when it comes to today's decision makers. If you're weak-minded, you'll be led by a Patsy Adams Smith and her ilk to believe those wasteful, overmanned railways were great. And the rail enthusiast with a genuine fondness for railway culture can deceive themselves that those wooden carriages and slow services, the shunting of old steam engines or whatever you remember, were somehow better when they simply weren't. The delusion helps us to cope with the poor quality of decision making today, but it's hardly a solution to it. Better decision making requires better decision makers, not the opium cloud of a half-remembered dream of what came before. Instead, look at the facts yourself, or come to this channel. As the episodes are rolled out, we will continue to look at the old annual reports, the old timetables and government reports, looking for the actual evidence of what the railways were really like. Next time, in Radically Rethinking Railways, we take a break from fighting those rosy assessments of our past. We did do some things well. We needed to do that more often. In our finest hour. See you then.